You're all going to die. Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, most welcome guests, all of you. How's that, Neen? But really. And when that day comes, what's going to be left of us? Eventually all of our possessions are going to be sold or passed on or disposed of, hopefully through a will or some other means. What will be left with us are our stories. If they're not stories that we wrote down, there will be stories about us, what people observed from us, our experiences, our choices, and what people can glean our values based on that. And eventually those people too will go the way of the earth. And then we'll be an artifact of history, a name, a date, maybe some historical records, maybe something on page 2 of Google. But that doesn't have to be the case. History books are full of people who have died a long time ago who continue to inspire people. Much more, there are grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren who know about their ancestors, who know the trials that they went through. Your life is more than just names and dates. It's full of heartbreak, of trials, of overcoming obstacles, of love, all of those things that can inspire millions of people if they only knew it. Do not cut yourself short and think that your life isn't interesting or worth passing on. This year marks the 150th birthday of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And let's be honest, she lived a mediocre life. But the reason why every town in the Midwest is clamoring for her legacy, whether through museums or through festivals or through stretches of South Broadway, is because she could tell a story. She was able to talk about her life growing up in the 1800s and make it relatable, because it wasn't just about dates and events. It was about the human aspect. Someday people are going to wonder what life was like in Rochester in the 21st century, during the emergence of the internet, through artificial intelligence and many other technologies that have revolutionized the world. They're going to want to know your perspective. Even if you share the same experience, well, so to speak, as somebody else who's sitting right next to you, you have a unique perspective. You have experiences that no one else has ever had. Or you've had experiences that many other people will have in the future and that you've learned from and that you've overcome and can share. So the best way to make your story relatable, the best way to make your life memorable is to relate it. It's to write it down. A lot of you are doing this through Toastmasters. You can do it through personal journals, you can do it through interviews, you can do it in many other ways. But when you take the time to write it down, you form a narrative. You take those events that happen in your life and you reflect on them. You realize, what did you know then? What did you not know then? What motivated you to make those decisions? And then suddenly, just those little points in the timeline are enshrined in a story. And that story can be timeless. Be open and honest in your stories. You don't have to share all of your egregious, deep, dark secrets, but you should be open and frank. It's those inconsistencies in our lives, those contradictions, that can really annoy people unless we're honest with them, and then they're kind of endearing. And then we realize, hey, this person's human. This person is just like me. So there are many ways that you can get started in doing this, in building a legacy, and I'll share 4 simple ways to start. One is through a daily journal. Don't worry about catching up. Don't worry about telling your whole life story up until now. Just start writing a journal, whether it be daily, weekly, or even monthly. One of my most prized possessions that I have is my father's journal, records from it. For about 20 years, he was able to organize his life in such a way that he was able to write down in his journal from the time that my older brothers and sisters were young through when I was born, up until my early teens. Sometimes they were every day. Sometimes they were once a month. Sometimes they were just a few sentences. Sometimes they were an entire page. In there, there's short, cute stories from when I was a kid, and some of the funny things that I would say. Obviously, I wouldn't remember any of these. And then there's more personal, more sensitive stories. For example, I often tell people I'm the youngest of 4 children, and that's an easy shorthand for what they're looking for. But the truth is that I'm the youngest of 5. After my two older siblings were born, the doctor told my mom that they wouldn't be able to have any more children. Heartbroken and still wanting a larger family, they decided to adopt. And so they found a young, soon-to-be mother who was putting her baby up for adoption. And my parents, thought and prayed about it and decided they would pursue that. So tomorrow will be Kaylee Ann's 36th birthday. They adopted her, brought her home. 2 months being with the family, they received a phone call from the birth mother's attorney saying that she was reconsidering. She hadn't yet signed the consent papers, so it was totally her call to make. Realizing that my parents had no legal options, they decided to, the best recourse was to have a one-on-one meeting with the mom. Driving over to their house, my dad wrote in his journal, with no legal consent, we knew there was no hope at this time. He said while they were driving to the house that Kaylee Ann, now 2 months old, wouldn't break eye contact with him. That she had this look in her eyes of pain, that she knew something was going on. They had the conversation with the mom, and she explained that she didn't really know what her rights were at the time, and that she's now really wanting to keep the child. And my dad said, with no legal consent, we knew that there was no hope at this time. My older siblings gave Kaylee a kiss, as did Christine and I. We then arose, handed Kaylee to her mother, and left for our home. Just a little over 2 months after that, they received a call from Kaylee Ann's stepmother saying that she had died of SIDS at that time. And my dad, when they went to the funeral, my dad he asked the mother what she had named the baby. He says, it's an old family name, she said, Christina Leanne. Using the initials from the first name, it becomes K. Leanne, or Kaylee Ann. Now that is a sensitive personal story, and I was debating whether or not to share it. But the reason I do is because if that were not recorded in my dad's journal and something that I was able to receive, I would know very little about that chapter of my family's life, much less very little about Kaylee Ann. But now she is a part of me. She is a part of our family. And what's worse, if that were not recorded down, there would be no government record that she was ever a part of our family. That would be completely lost to history. It would be, so that's just one example of being able to write things down in a journal. Another example is chronologically. That's how we often hear about biographies or people telling their life stories of Benjamin Franklin, or as Ed shared in his icebreaker speech. That is probably the harder way to do it, because there's so much that we want to include that we just don't have space for. So try to keep it at a high level. Try to find the meaning. Try to find the narrative. Doesn't mean exclude everything that doesn't fit that tight narrative, but have it be a story. Have it be something that someone is willing to read. Another way to do it, a simple way, is through writing prompts. Your life is full of moments, of experiences, of fears, of hopes. You can go online, or you can make up your own questions to consider, like, what do you consider your greatest accomplishment? What scares you? What are your earliest memories of your mother? What is your day like today? Those kinds of things can share a great glimpse into your life and who you are as a person that other people can learn from and learn more about you from. And then the last way to do it, if you're not a writer, is to be interviewed. So just a couple years before my grandma died, her daughter interviewed her and asked her about her childhood, asked her about her parents. Her father also died when she was 13 on Christmas Day, and that affected the way that she remembered the holidays, and she had to overcome that when she had children of her own. She was a newlywed in San Francisco when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. She raised 6 kids on a very meager income, and she shared her stories about how she was able to do that. Now, each of us, as her grandchildren, have copies of that video. Imagine how precious that will be even just 50 years from now, where my grandchildren can hear about their great-great-grandmother. When my latest daughter was born a year ago, we wanted to name her after somebody in our family, someone who was inspiring. The sad truth is we can only choose from those who shared their stories, who wrote it down. Luckily, I come from a family where there was good record keeping. A lot of journals were kept and saved and preserved. And so we were able to find the story of my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother who lived in England in the early 1800s. And she had a very inspiring story about how she grew up in a very posh, well-to-do family in England. But because of her convictions, she changed faiths and had to give all of that up. She was shunned by her community. Her children were no longer able to attend school. But her and her husband continued to serve and continued to be faithful. They eventually migrated over here to the United States right about the time of the Civil War, so they had to come in by way of Canada. Eventually, they joined with the Mormon pioneers and trekked west. This entire journey was full of death and of hardship and of sorrow. And on their way crossing the plains, her husband died and had to bury him without a casket because they needed to move on to beat the winter. And her daughter-in-law, who was sharing this story, for sake of time, I'll abbreviate. But he said, you can just imagine somebody who grew up in that kind of posh lifestyle now trekking across the plains in the scorching heat with just the sounds of wagon wheels cranking and of possible Native American wallows of war and of crying of death. And yet she was able to make it. She never lost her faith, and she was able to raise a great posterity. And now my daughter has a namesake to live up to because of that. If you want your story to continue after you die, you need to share it. The greatest monument that you have is not going to be any pyramid. It's not going to be anything named after you. It's going to be your stories. Don't let that die with you. Mr. Toastmaster.